and welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be doing some sewing tips for beginners and some thrift flip hacks. I think one, maybe two people asked me to do a video like this, and it really got to me. I was like, wow, I have a video request. Like, LA, do I call you first or do you call me? So here you go, this one's for you. I decided to split this into two videos. So if you're interested in learning about some sewing basics and the stitches that I use all the time, keep watching this video. But if you're more interested in learning about some thrift flip hacks that I use, so say that you already are comfortable with sewing and the basics, then move on over to the second part of this series and learn about some thrift flip hacks that I use all the time. So I'm going to start out with some sewing basics. This will be like sewing 101, some techniques and skills that I think everybody should know when they're starting sewing. Just a little disclaimer, I have no formal education with sewing. I've never been to a class or anything. Everything that I know I've learned from my mom or my grandma and just by practicing. I think once you know the foundation of sewing, it's really easy to build on that and do more complex things and have some fun with it. So I hope that this helps you start sewing. So first things first, when I go to cut my fabric to make a piece, I always like to use an old shirt or an old pair of shorts, whatever I'm making, as reference for the measurements. Or you could use string, a tape measure, and actually measure like your chest, your waist, depends on what you're making. So today I'll just be using some scrap fabric that I have to kind of demonstrate the sewing techniques. After you measure how you want to cut the fabric, it's important to cut a straight line. Depending on the material, I like to use a straight edge or a ruler to draw a faint line with a pencil. You could also use fabric chalk, but I don't have it. This will help make sure you cut a straight line. I remember growing up, my grandma was obsessed with these one pair of scissors and didn't let me or my siblings use them, and I never really understood why until I started sewing. Because good sewing scissors are like the prized possession. You want good, sharp fabric scissors that can cut straight through your material. To mimic the cut, you can fold over the fabric to make sure it's the same length and using that already cut side to guide you to cut a straight line. Now that you have your fabric cut, it's time to pin it together. Pinning your fabric ensures that it stays nice and lined up straight when sewing. When going to pin your fabric, you want to place your material right side to right side. That means that whatever side you want to be showing when you're wearing the piece should be facing inwards towards each other. So for example, if your material has a pattern on one side, you want that pattern side to face inwards to each other. There's two ways to pin your fabric, horizontally or vertically. I tend to pin horizontally, but there's really no right or wrong way. Pinning horizontally allows you to pull the pins out quickly when sewing, but pinning vertically is nice too because it allows you to just sew directly over the pins. Either way, once your fabric is all pinned in place, it's time to sew. I have the Singer 7430 sewing machine. All sewing machines have similar functions and stitches. The most common stitch is the straight stitch, which is what I'll be showing you here first. Each sewing machine is a little different, but once you pick the straight stitch function on your machine, you can change the width and length of the stitch. I usually stick to somewhere in between with a 3.5 width and a 2.5 length. Next, you want to sew straight down the fabric. You want to make sure that you're sewing a straight line so your fabric doesn't end up lopsided. A tip I use when I first started sewing is using a piece of painter's tape to line my fabric against when sewing. You can line the edge of your material against the edge of this tape, and then that will make sure that you are sewing in a straight line. There's also a little ruler by the foot of the sewing machine that is helpful, but by adding a piece of tape, you can elongate that ruler. When you get ready to start sewing, you want to sew a few stitches forward, then hit the reverse button or lever on your sewing machine and sew a few stitches backwards. Then go forward again and continue with your stitch as normal. This is called a back stitch, which creates a knot in your thread to ensure that it doesn't unravel on itself. You want to do this at the beginning and end of each seam. So when you are done sewing all the way down your fabric, you want to do a few stitches backwards again to create that knot. Okay, so that tutorial was great and all, but what if you don't have a sewing machine? How are you going to sew a straight stitch without a sewing machine, you may ask? Do not fear. I'm also going to show you how to sew a straight stitch by hand. So, here you go. When sewing by hand, you start out with the same steps as you would when sewing with a machine. Cut your fabric straight across and pin it together. After pinning, I like to use a straight edge or ruler and draw a line where I want the seam to be. This will help you when sewing by hand to line up your stitches. It is then time to sew. Thread your needle, and it's best to use a thread color that matches your fabric. Similar to sewing with a machine, you want to create a knot at the end of your seam to prevent it from unraveling. You do this by pulling your needle and thread through both pieces of the fabric and then back under the fabric and through that same hole. Before pulling all the thread through the hole, pull your needle through the loop of that thread. This will create a knot. After you create a knot, you can continue sewing. Do this by pulling your needle up and through the fabric and then back down and through the fabric. When sewing by hand, you can control how narrow or how wide the stitches are, depending on how much space you leave in between them. Really wide stitches will be looser and less sturdy compared to a narrow stitch. So if you want a tight and secure seam, try sewing your stitches short and close together. Again, when you get to the end of your seam, create a knot using the same technique. You now have a completed seam sewn by hand. Next, I'll be showing you guys how to sew a zigzag stitch on the machine. I mostly use a straight stitch, but a zigzag stitch is nice when using stretchy fabric because it prevents it from becoming stiff or when wanting to prevent fabric from fraying, like I'm going to use in this example. Change your sewing machine to a zigzag stitch. Again, I leave the length and width in the middle at 3.5 and 2.5. A zigzag stitch is just what it sounds like. The needle will go from side to side when sewing and create a zigzag line down your fabric. Here I am going to sew a zigzag stitch on the edge of my two pieces of fabric to prevent them from fraying. This will give the item a cleaner and more professional look. To do this, you want to line up the edge of your fabric right underneath the needle so the needle moves side to side on the outside of the fabric into the edge of the fabric. This locks in the fabric and will prevent it from fraying. So those are the things that I use all the time when sewing, making sure you cut your fabric correctly and measure it correctly, pinning it right side to right side, and then using a straight or zigzag stitch to make the new seams. Again, remember you can always do the things by hand. It may take a little bit longer, but put on a good playlist and just jam out and sew yourself something new. And remember to click on over to part 2 of this series. There I'll be talking about some thrift flip hacks that I use all the time, and they're great when trying to alter clothes that doesn't fit you quite right. But that's all for this video, so I hope that you guys enjoyed it and that you're staying safe and healthy, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!